Welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to start actually looking at markup and how to mark up text. We'll be talking specifically about text level or phrasing semantics. So let's look at an example of content. Here we have a simple paragraph of information about a cuttlefish. A couple sentences, some commas, some conjunctions, all that sort of good stuff. Now, looking at this little bit at the end here, cuttlefish are not fish but mollusks, seems kind of important. Now, HTML supports a couple of different ways of increasing the importance of a given phrase or word. The first I want to talk about is the strong element, which indicates that certain content is of strong importance. So if we were to wrap a strong element, so an opening and closing strong tag, around cuttlefish are not fish but mollusks, we would be saying that this is something that is of strong importance. If you think about this being read aloud, you might think of something like, despite their name, cuttlefish are not fish but mollusks. Now the default display of this in a browser is to make it bold. Using CSS, we could make it look any other way we want to, but that's the default appearance in a browser. Now another way that we could emphasize a particular phrase is by using the emphasis element. The emphasis element is a little bit different than strong importance because it's just trying to emphasize in some way. So despite their name, cuttlefish are not fish but mollusks. So it's a slightly different inflection. We're emphasizing it, but it's not really different in terms of being of strong importance. It's just something that's being emphasized. There's a little bit different intention behind the use of emphasis versus strong. Now in terms of the display in the browser, here you see that the emphasis element gets displayed in italics by default. Now the I element, as we've discussed earlier, is used for text that's in an alternate voice or mood, or even an alternate language. So we saw before with some of the other examples of words that were in another language were highlighted using the I element. So here we have Cepida and cephalopoda, and these are Latin terms, so we might want to mark those up in I elements, and then those also become italicized automatically. And as I mentioned in the last chapter, we can use the lang attribute to indicate that those are actually Latin. Now the class attribute is used to extend the meaning of any element. So in HTML, we only have a limited number of elements available to us, and sometimes we need to extend the meaning of a particular element in order to use it in a specific context. So I'll give you an example. We had our Cepida and cephalopoda terms, which were marked up in I elements. We could classify those as being taxonomic terms. So not only are these potentially in Latin, which is not displayed here using the lang attribute, but we could say that these terms are being used specifically having to do with taxonomy, right? And then if we wanted to, we could further classify those elements as being the order and class specifically. So taxonomy, order, class, these are not elements that exist in HTML, but we could indicate using classification that these I elements are for taxonomy together. Each one is for taxonomy. They both share that. But then one is specifically classified as an order and one is specifically classified as a class. We can use these classifications for styling purposes, for scripting purposes, or in order to expose information from the page to other technologies. In terms of the actual display, they still look like italics, but we've added a little bit more semantic meaning to the document by indicating how these particular elements are operating. Now in terms of best practices, it's important to keep your class names meaningful. You don't want to classify something as big red text, because down the road, maybe the design changes and now all of a sudden that is small blue text. So if we use class names that are meaningful and actually have some semantic value to them, then they will be able to persist even if the actual display, the style of that particular element changes over time. So let's look at a new passage here. Here we have another passage from the Cuttlefish website, and we see a familiar friend in there, an I element with a class of taxonomy, so it shares that with the other two instances of I that we saw earlier. But in this case, we're dealing with a binomial, which is the genus and the species, Sepia apama. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to look at a different challenge. So here we have a couple of different phrases that have to deal with measurements. And specifically, we have these abbreviations for elements cm, in, kg, lb, and when we extract those out, really what those mean is centimeters, inches, kilograms, and pounds. Now in HTML, we actually have an element that allows us to expose this information to users, and that's the abbreviation element, or ABBR. It indicates abbreviations and then gives an expansion for that particular abbreviation. So in terms of these 4 abbreviations, what we're looking at is an abbreviation element with a title that gives the expansion of the term. So abbreviation title equals centimeters for cm, abbreviation title inches for in, and so on and so forth. If I drop them in context, it would look something like this. Now, hopping over into the browser, what you see is that this title information actually gets exposed as tooltips. That's pretty awesome. Now, unfortunately, from an assistive technology standpoint, that title information is not read out to users, at least not reliably. Most screen readers ignore title attributes unless specifically instructed to read those out. In terms of assistive technology, if we want it to actually read out 15 to 25 centimeters or 5.9 to 9.8 inches, then we need to go an alternate route, and this is where ARIA label comes in. ARIA label is actually read out as the label for this particular element. So when the element's encountered, cm, the text centimeters would be read out instead. Let's look at a quick example.
They generally range in size from 15 to 25 centimeters.
Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted it to sound like. Let's say we are dealing with a reference to a particular publication, such as the Journal of Experimental Biology, as you see here. HTML has an element for referencing publication names, titles of films, and the like. And that's the cite element. We can wrap the cite element around the Journal of Experimental Biology, and then we have indicated that this is a citation. We could take it a step further and perhaps classify this particular citation as being a journal name. Or you could say a magazine, or if it's a book title or a movie title, maybe you give it a classification based on that, in case you want to style each one differently. In terms of visible display, Cite automatically is given italics in pretty much every browser. Now sometimes when you're creating an HTML document, you might be discussing something like, well, HTML, as I'm doing here. Now here's an example of that. I'm a big fan of the title attribute, but I wish it was better supported by screen readers. So here I'm discussing code, and this is where I could actually use the code element to indicate that this is in fact code. Again, I might want to take it a step further and classify this code that I'm talking about as being HTML. This is just another example of how classification can further extend the semantics that are built into HTML to indicate the sort of content that's being contained inside the element. The code element will be displayed in a monotype font, usually a slab serif, so that it looks like text from a typewriter. One of the new HTML5 elements actually allows us to indicate times, dates, and the like on our pages. So here we see 15 August 2014. As you may have guessed, this is the time element. Now the time element can simply be wrapped around the date, or you can take it a step further with the date-time attribute and actually provide a computer-readable date in the international date format of year, month, day, separated by hyphens. Now I've talked about a bunch of different options with respect to HTML that exists, so tags that are available to us, elements that exist within HTML, but sometimes those semantics aren't enough, even with classification, to do what we want them to do. So how do we deal with arbitrary bits of text? Here we have an introduction to Cuttlefish. If I wanted to select a portion of this, I could use a span element. This is used for arbitrary spans of text. So if I wanted to only show the word introduction, as opposed to an introduction to cuttlefish, I could wrap the stuff that I don't want to show in a span element. So here we see a span element around an and the space, and a second span element around the space and to cuttlefish. I've included the spaces inside of those elements as opposed to around introduction in order to ensure that those spaces are not exposed visibly in the browser. And the reason is that I am going to classify these spans as hidden and then use CSS to make them disappear. If I left the spaces outside of those elements, there would be a space both before and after the word introduction, which may not be desirable in terms of the actual display of the page. Now I'll show you an example of how this plays out momentarily, but let's look at another option for arbitrary spans of text. The B element used to be for bold, but in HTML5 it was actually switched to mean that it's text that's offset in some way but is of no greater importance than the text surrounding it. In other words, they made the B element essentially a shorter span. So I could just as easily say B class equals hidden instead of span class equals hidden. Now I've used this approach on the Fascinating Cuttlefish site in the navigation. Let's look at that example. So here you see if I inspect the introduction navigation item and expand that link, you can see it actually says an introduction to cuttlefish, even though visibly all we see is the word introduction. That's pretty cool. The B element can also be useful when we want to highlight the name of a person or a product or something like that. Again, text that's set off in some way as being different than the text surrounding it, but is of no greater importance. So here we have Nick Hobgood, and he is a person. So I could give him a class of person and use the B element there. So in this chapter, we've talked about a variety of text level semantic elements such as strong, emphasis, I for an alternate voice or mood or an alternate language, how to use classification to extend semantics, abbreviation elements, the cite element, code, time, and then arbitrary spans of text using span and B. In the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about URLs, links, and file references before we dive into more organizational semantics.